Hi again guys, and welcome to the third installment of Circuit Strategies. This is a series where, if you're unfamiliar with it, we take a track, generally a longer, more technical one where some people find it challenging, and we break it down. We tell you what you need to know about the track, how to actually break down a fast flying lap, and also the kind of strategies you might need for a short race, for a longer race, how to deal with bad drivers, the typical mistakes and dangers of that particular track, and the kind of cars and tuning that you will need. Now, for this particular episode, we're following on pretty naturally, I would say, from the last episode featuring the Nürburgring to my personal favourite racetrack, which is Le Mans. Now, technically the circuit is Circuit de la Sarthe, and Le Mans is more so the event, but often the track is referred to as Le Mans anyway. Now, one of the unique things about Le Mans compared to many other tracks, including the Nürburgring, is it features quite a lot of public roads. That adds a unique challenge because roads for the public, of course, are hardly the same as roads for a racetrack. You will often have, for instance, a camber in the centre of the road for rain runoff, such as here at Le Mans on Audier Straight, which you would never see, for instance, on a straight section at the Nürburgring. So it adds these unique challenges. The road is bumpier. You'll often see prototypes and Formula cars kind of bouncing down the straight. It adds this level of instability to some of the corners, which won't, of course, ruin a lap, but it's something which more beginner drivers need to know. Now, as far as what you need to know about the track itself, it's one of the longest tracks in the game, one of the longest tracks in the world as well, about 8.5 miles, or just under 14 kilometres, which is still, of course, a fair ways off the size of the Nürburgring, and certainly nowhere near our first episode's size of Special Stage Route X, but it kind of adds a unique flavour of putting those two tracks that I just mentioned together, because it's very long, very iconic and very old, like the Nürburgring, but also you spend about 80 to 85% of the time at full throttle, which is much more like Route X. So it's this interesting mix of a racetrack, where it has the vibe of like an oval track in some cases, where you've got these ultra high speed sections and curving flowing corners, but also some surprisingly technical sections. Now, as far as the kind of lap breakdown that you'll need to do, I'm actually going to change it up a bit, and instead of numbering the corners, I'm actually going to put the names of the primary corners that you need to know to add a little bit more to getting to know the track, getting to feel like you're friends with the track, if you will, because knowing the circuit is half the battle to winning. Of course, a car is good, tuning is good, being a good driver in general, but if you don't know the circuit, all of that means nothing. So we're going to get straight into a full lap breakdown with slowed down footage. I'm going to use this same Audi, the Audi R18 LMP1, and incidentally, if you like the look of the tune and want to try it out for yourself, I've put a link in the description to the exact tune setup that I'm using. Now, starting a lap at Le Mans is very easy because you've got a nice straight section, leads straight into this curving right, which is a deceptive corner because it's all about preparation for this almost 90-degree left, leading immediately into a much, much sharper right. It's a key point there for not getting bunched up. Now, this section of right, left, this is all about the flow. You want to keep the performance moderate. Don't try and go through at full speed, unless of course you're in something like a Red Bull, but 9 times out of 10 you won't be. This corner, this sharper than you'd think right-hander into the straight, it's easy to run wide, shouldn't matter too much unless strong penalties are on. Now, as far as the straights at Le Mans, without the chicanes, they're very simple. It's a perfect place for overtaking, of course, and it really does come down to the tuning that you've applied to your car. If you choose a car that just doesn't have enough top speed, then it doesn't really matter how good you are through the corners, you're not going to win. If, however, you choose a car on the track with the chicanes, such as here, then of course you'll need to scrub off the speed much earlier, as I did here with the Audi, allow the car to kind of coast with a moderate amount of power, and then focus on getting the power down as you exit the chicane, rather than trying to go as quickly as possible through them. My recommendation when it comes to the two chicanes on Le Mans are don't try to get through the corners as quickly as possible. Instead, have the attitude that you're trying not to lose as much time as possible. So if you focus on exiting the chicanes quicker, you can make up a lot of lost time. As far as this final section of the straight, same thing goes. It's a nice little power section, not quite as long, it's a little bit bumpier, but you want to be preparing for the sharpest corner on the track. The only kind of hairpin, but not really, you want to brake basically as soon as you see those rumble strips on the right hand. Don't run too wide, of course, into the sand. It's a very common mistake point, one of, say, 2 or 3 major corners on the track where that can happen. And it leads into this section, which is one of my personal favourites, where you can basically just treat it like a straight line. Now, this corner is a great one for making up time and making up a lead, but entering this first tight left and then almost immediately the tight right-hander at about a 90-degree angle is very easy to mess up. In fact, it's the most common 2 corners on the track that you'll just go straight off, because you tend to feel more confident about those 2 corners than you should. You should be focusing on how quick the car is going, feeling that the car's not going to understeer too much, because then again you can make that speed up exiting that section rather than trying to go through it as quickly as possible. Now, coming up to this flowing section, again, this is a lot of what Le Mans is about. It's not about really sharp hairpins and square corners, it's more about the flow. Now, this curving right is all about preparation for this immediate left, because it's very, very easy to run way too wide, and if you do, you will end up in the sand. You've got a small right and a small left. Again, in a prototype, you don't even notice it. And coming up to the final section, this is where you'll often see people just cutting straight across the chicanes. In a more professional event, hopefully that won't happen, but the key again is not so much to try and get through them as fast as you can, it's just try not to lose too much speed. And those, as I said, are 2 very different approaches. Trying not to lose too much speed allows you to exit the corner more quickly because you haven't wasted too much time through the corners. And that's my essential guide for the lap itself. What then about the tuning and about the choice of car? Now, as far as actually selecting your vehicle and the tuning of said vehicle for Le Mans, it's a relatively unique position compared to a lot of other tracks, because if you compare it, for instance, to the previous 2 episodes, on Special Stage Route X, the tuning tends to be fairly similar for a lot of cars. It's mostly about top speed, acceleration doesn't matter as much as long as you have good top speed, and the handling needs to be more than anything else stable. You don't necessarily need a car that has the sharpest steering, it just needs to be stable at high speed. Then consider the Nürburgring. Be it a race car or a road car, I would argue the most important aspect of the car's overall character and personality is its handling. Because you can have as much or as little power as you want at the Nürburgring, it's more about that average speed through the corners, which is consequently why even here on the channel you could see me, I believe in one of the Beards and Cars episodes, using a classic Mini in like N100 and annihilating N400 and N500 cars because it's all about that cornering. Now, here at Le Mans, as I mentioned, it's totally different because you have to blend both, and consequently when you change from a race car to a road car, the parameters of what will allow that car that you choose to win completely change. Whereas on the Nordschleife or at Special Stage Route X, the same kinds of car will often be good enough to win. Good handling, good top speed, it pretty much remains the same. Here at Le Mans, I would argue it's totally different, because in a prototype or a formula car, top speed is very important, especially on the older circuit without the chicanes, but handling actually makes much more of a difference than you'd think, because that average speed, especially at the start and the end of the lap, make up a massive amount of lost time, to the point where even the Audi that I'm using in this video is only 3 seconds off the pace of the Jaguar XJR9, which is a far more powerful car with a significantly higher top speed. So logically you would assume that the Jag would destroy the Audi, but 3 seconds is not that much of a difference, especially given that this Audi actually has one of the slowest LMP top speeds in the game. So it really goes to show that in this prototype kind of level, and it also goes for formula cars if you use them here, or even something like GT machines, like GT3s, that kind of thing, it's more about the handling and specifically the high speed flow. So I would recommend choosing a car which has a good mix of good top-end acceleration, even more so than top speed, because there's no point in having a great top speed if you never get there, and also be able to take corners at easily above 100 miles per hour without giving up too much throttle or constantly trying to keep the car in check. So this is the kind of track where something like a Corvette or a Ferrari will typically have the kind of handling that you need, because they are cars which thrive at this mid-level of handling. These are cars which aren't necessarily the best handling thing top end, and they might be a little bit skittish ultra low end. But at the middle sweet spot, which is the vast majority of corners on this track, they are very, very good. And that is completely different to the Nürburgring, where there are plenty of very low speed corners where you can easily just spin up your tyres. Not the case at Le Mans, nowhere near as much. There are only a couple, maybe even 4 corners you could say. The Dunlop chicane, which we'll say is 2 corners because you've got the left and then the right. Indianapolis, followed by Arnage, which are both, as I said, very deceptive, but those are pretty much the 4 only corners where that danger comes into play, because you're slowing down so much for essentially 90-degree turns. So as far as street cars go, I would actually recommend looking more so for high power and very good mid-range and top-end acceleration, because for road cars, the handling doesn't tend to vary quite as much as it will in, for instance, a prototype class. If you compare the handling on a Mazda 787B to a Porsche 919 to a Mazda LM55 to a Vision GT, then those Group 1 cars will all be completely different. In a road car, if you compare something like, say, a Ferrari 458 to a Corvette C7 Stingray to a Ferrari Enzo, they do vary of course, but it doesn't feel like they vary quite as much as something like a prototype can, or at least that's my opinion, and I'm sure there are people who would feel differently about that. What I mean is essentially that road cars, they all have the same good and bad points. They all tend to be heavier than a race car through corners. They all tend to have weaker brakes, and then the minutiae of the detail between them tends to be smaller. Whereas with a prototype, if you have one with bad brakes, it's a massive difference. You can notice it immediately. Because a car which has more straight line grunt, naturally, like a Hellcat for instance, or others, it doesn't have to be that example, they can make up a ton of lost time, and that is when it completely changes from prototypes racing each other to road cars, because with prototypes, as I mentioned earlier on, you really need to hone in on that handling, because top speed is not enough. With a road car, a really good top speed, really good high-end acceleration and a lot of grunt makes a massive advantage. Back in the day, even on Forza for instance, I used to often choose a car that had really bad handling but a huge amount of power, and I would win against cars which on any other track would wipe the floor with what I was driving. For instance, in a supercar race, you take an SSC Ultimate Aero around this track on, for instance, Forza 4 and put it up against something like, say, a McLaren F1. On any other track, the McLaren F1 would destroy the Ultimate Aero. But at Le Mans, the overwhelming straight line speed made up enough of a gap for me to pretty much never lose under circumstances like those. So in a road car, that can be a huge advantage, whereas in a race car, it just isn't. Because even if you have that kind of top speed, it's immediately negated by the chicanes, because you just can't get to the speed quick enough, 9 times out of 10 at least, so it is much more about the handling. So as far as road cars go, of course it varies. If you're in an ultra low class like N100 or N200, then you'll need to focus in more on something with any kind of top speed advantage, because here it makes just that, a huge advantage. If you're talking higher categories where all of the cars are quicker, like N500 and above, then it's more about the small differences in the handling, but also make sure you choose a car that has that top end grunt. Not just top speed, but good acceleration. Even if the acceleration is arguably better than the top speed, for instance something that gets to 200 really quickly compared to something that can do 220 but takes longer to get there. With the chicanes, that guy in the 220 mph car isn't going to get there anyway, so having a car that can get to a lower speed but more rapidly is a big advantage. Now, to speak next on the point of bad drivers, where you'll often see bad drivers surface, again in particular on the chicane version of the circuit, but it can apply to both, you will typically see bad drivers very early on, because Le Sarthe, or Le Mans, is one of the best tracks in the game, one of the best tracks in the world even, for people who want to cheat, because there are so many chicanes that are easy to cut, especially at the start and the end of the lap. Once you're on the straight, it doesn't matter too much anyway, but on those crucial corners, in particular the Dunlop chicane and the Ford chicanes at the end of the lap, those corners, both at the start and the end, are very easy to cut, So those are the corners in particular where you need to watch out for bad drivers in public lobbies. There's not much you can do to stop those drivers beyond kicking them, so be more aware of them slamming into you. If they go straight into the side of you, for instance, say you're trying to drive properly, going around the corner, they're trying to go straight across it. But apart from that, you don't need to worry too much. It's a fairly wide open track. Drivers don't tend to be bunched up that much at Le Mans. It's a pretty good track for that. The road feels a lot bigger and wider than the Nürburgring, for instance. And the only other worry potentially is the Mulsanne hairpin right at the end of the Honor straight, because again, people might just brake too late by accident or deliberately and slam into the back of you. But again, there's not too much you can do about that beyond looking behind you and moving out of the way. But in particular, it's the Ford chicanes right at the end and the Dunlop chicane right at the start where most bad drivers will make themselves known. And finally, of course, last but most definitely not least when it comes to a track as iconic as this one, endurance tips. What kind of differences does a long race make compared to a short one? On tracks like the Nürburgring, for instance, or Route X, the lap is so long that if you miss the pits, it's a big deal. This is a long track, but not quite as long. It's less than half the length of Route X. It's, 4 or 5 miles off the length of the Nürburgring, so it's not quite as drastic a mistake if you do pit in a little bit too late or too early. So what are my recommendations? Well, as far as this track goes, you will typically see more of a problem with your tyres wearing out quicker than fuel. Because on the Nürburgring, you need to be watching your fuel very well, whereas here at Le Mans, you're going so quickly and you're braking so harshly and turning in at such high speeds that you wear through brakes, or wear through tyres I should say, but also put a lot of stress on brakes in the real world very quickly. Now, doing so, of course, means that they're going to wear out quicker. So the biggest piece of advice that I would give is try, especially in an endurance event, to choose the hardest tyres you can, because they'll simply last longer. Try to choose a car which may have, for instance, more top-end power rather than low-end torque, because then, for instance, like a Formula engine compared to a muscle car. A muscle car shreds its tyres very easily, whereas something up there like a prototype or a Formula vehicle, they can spin up their tyres for sure, but it's not as much of an issue if you just use better throttle control. Whereas with something that's naturally torquey and wants to just slide around all the time, like a muscle car, a Mercedes AMG, a Dodge Viper, you're going to notice those rear tyres going real quick. Whereas in something like a prototype, you might actually notice your front tyres wearing out a little bit quicker. Now, as far as how to combat that in an endurance race, how to maximise the time between pit stops, of course there's not much you can do about your fuel usage unless you're in something like a hybrid. Now, it's not like Route X where you can get in behind someone's draft and get an extra lap or two out of it, but you can still employ some of that technique on the Honor straight, especially without the chicanes, because you're taking the whole thing at very high speed, try to get in behind someone and just save a little bit of fuel. And of course, most races of that nature will tend to be in prototypes anyway, and a lot of those do have hybrid systems, so the hybrids tend to work exiting corners. On the top end speeds of the straight, you don't need to worry about that, but try to, for instance, exit corners with a little bit less throttle. Try to maximise the usage of slipstream on the Honor straight, even with the chicanes, but even more so without them, and also on the Mulsanne after the hairpin at the end of an Honor. Again, try to get in behind other people, don't just try and be in the lead all the time unless it actually matters that you are. For instance, you're near to the end of the event or you need to get to the pits, get in and out quicker than everyone else. Choosing a car with better fuel economy of course makes a massive difference, but you could say that about any endurance race. Choosing when to pit in, I would argue, as I mentioned just now, is much more about the tyres on this track than it is about fuel, which can be totally different on other circuits. Again, compare it to Route X, tyres don't matter too much, they last fairly well, whereas fuel goes down real fast because you're constantly at top end speeds. Here, it's the opposite. You've got such high stress corners and extremely high speed corners, it really does wear out the rubber very, very quickly. Now, as far as my tips overall, that's pretty much it for endurance racing. Choose the hardest tyres you can if it's a really long event. Try to pick something that has the best possible fuel economy, but also, for instance, that has a good level of top-end speed, but without necessarily needing to rev to infinity. So maybe not a Formula car, for instance, something that's, you know, like a diesel, for instance, like the Peugeot 908 or the Audis. Diesels rev lower. They are torquey, but they don't necessarily just shred tyres all the time. They're actually very easy to work with, which is yet another reason why they dominate so much at Le Mans. And although the hybrids are taking over more now, the diesels still have that huge advantage to their name. They have great fuel economy, they have a very smooth power delivery despite having a massive amount of torque, and that kind of torque in a street car would just be shredding up the tyres all the time. Whereas on this track, it just doesn't have that effect because, as I mentioned earlier on, a lot more of the corners are more moderate to high speed rather than getting right down to like 30 or 40 miles per hour and speeding up again. So overall, that's it for my recommendations on Le Mans, with the full lap breakdown, the kinds of cars you should choose, the kind of things you should be cautious of, and overall, it's a very forgiving track. It's easily my favourite racetrack, and it's the kind of track where it doesn't take you quite as long to master it as you might think, because it's fairly simple once you get it down. It really is about choosing the right car, being cautious of other drivers, pitting in at the right time, which is fairly obvious to know when you are losing too much time on a lap, for instance, and overall, it's the kind of circuit where it feels like the track wants to work with you, not against you. And that's a nice difference, because there are some circuits which really do feel like a slog, if you will. For me, Le Mans is not one of those. It's a very pleasant track and a very fun one, and laps don't even take that long because of how high the average speed is. But that's it for my strategy guide overall. Of course, if you're new to this series, then I'd recommend clicking through here on screen to see the previous two, and if you're watching it down the line, of course, future episodes as well. And for now, as always, thanks for watching.